You will notice in your booklet that the next section of Pilgrim's Progress is entitled Christian Meets Faithful. So we're told right off the bat he's going to meet another character along the way, which makes sense, right? We've seen a number of individuals come through Christian's life, and we'll see some more individuals mentioned in the course of this particular section as well. Christian has now passed successfully through the valley of humiliation, where he had to deal with Apollyon, and through the valley of the shadow of death, in which he had to deal with the darkness all around him as the difficulties of life pressed in on him. And he has come out into the light, as you see at the end of the previous section, and he has sung his great hymn of trust in Christ, confessing that it was, of course, Christ that has brought him through this. And so now he continues on his journey, and the next section begins with this paragraph. Now, as Christian went on his way, he saw faithful, okay, there's the person he's going to be introduced to. He sees faithful before him upon his journey. So he's now come to a point where he sees faithful up ahead of him, and so he's going towards him. At this, Christian, putting out all of his strength, overran faithful, so the last was first, so that when he was behind him, now he's ahead of him. So he runs ahead of him as quickly as he can. Then did Christian, now catch this sentence, then did Christian vaingloriously smile, because he had got the start of his brother, because he had gotten ahead of his brother. So he smiles with this vainglorious smile. Vainglorious is this idea of prideful, a sense of self-worth sense. Vainglorious, glorious being something good, vainglorious being the opposite of it, of a sense of pride. So he smiles with this vainglorious smile. But he did not take heed to his feet and stumbled. He fell and could not rise again until faithful came to help him. Then they went on very lovingly together, talking of all that had happened to them in their pilgrimage. All right, now, it's interesting that Bunyan puts this in here. I find Bunyan to be clever and interesting, because he slides in, if you will, along the way, various little bits of instruction or warning about various aspects of living the Christian life. The kinds of things you wouldn't just kind of think of right off the bat. But he finds little places to put them in. Apparently he had a lot of time on his hands. So as he's riding along, he comes and he puts this here, right? Why would he write a story, or why would he write a paragraph, I should say, about Christian overrunning faithful, who he sees ahead of him, and then as he gets past him, because he's running faster than him and he outruns him, he gets ahead of him, turns around and smiles with this vainglorious smile at him, and then falls flat on his face. Well, there's obviously a lesson in there, you would think, right? So this is one of those little nuggets in Pilgrim's Progress that is designed, I think, to tell us something. Now, you'll notice there's no biblical reference here. There should be. I would say Proverbs 16:18 belongs here. Anybody know what Proverbs 16:18 says? Pride goeth before a fall. Yeah. The actual is pride goes before destruction, right? And a haughty spirit before a fall. So, but we shorten it to pride goeth before a fall, because it's one of those gloriously interesting Hebrew parallelisms where you say something twice in a different way in order to punch it up a little bit, right? Really should have been referenced here, because that's what Bunyan is doing. He's painting Christian as having a moment of pride in himself about where he is on the path in regards to faithful. It would seem to me, my interpretation of this might be, if you have a different interpretation, I'd certainly be interested in hearing about it, but my interpretation of this would be, here's a situation where Christian makes it through the two valleys. Now he comes out, he sees another believer ahead of him, and he's inclined to believe that he is more mature, more spiritual, further along on the path than someone else. And the result of it is, as he thinks about himself in that way or pursues himself, again, it's an allegory designed to make a point, right? The allegory sees runs ahead, quote unquote, and as he runs ahead, he turns around to smile vaingloriously at somebody else. Look at me, look how great I am. Boom, falls flat on his face, right? Watch yourself, lest ye stumble, right? I think that's the picture that Bunyan is painting here. We need to be careful that we do not think of ourselves more highly than we ought. Would be another way to put that. The Lord is going to lead all of us in our journey of sanctification in very different ways and at very different speeds. That's just a fact. There's no resisting that. There will be some who have spent all of their life as Christians, and they get to the end of their life and they feel like they're no further along than they were when they were 18. And then there were others who start off with very little understanding and grow into strong, deep, spiritual, mature, knowledgeable individuals. Our problem is that we have a tendency to compare ourselves to one another, don't we? So we assume that it's better to be, or to claim, I should say, to be better, more spiritual, more knowledgeable, more mature than somebody else. We'll be careful of that. Because it's easy to compare yourself to others and find yourself flat on your face. Because pride goeth before a fall. The very essence of thinking of yourself more highly than you ought to. If in fact we are, as Paul says in Colossians 3, to clothe ourselves in humility and meekness and patience and forbearance, then the last thing we ought to be doing is comparing ourselves to others in terms of our spiritual walk. That I'm more spiritual than you. I'm smarter than you. Right? I've got more training than you. Yeah, you're also more prideful and sinful by the way you're talking, by definition, right? So Bunyan slides this in, I think, as sort of a little warning to his fellow believers and to those of us reading this. Be careful that you don't think that you are ahead of someone else. It isn't that important. The bottom line is that in the end, when the resurrection happens and we're all raised to glory, is anybody really going to be able to claim that they're further ahead than somebody else? No, we're all going to stand before the Lord of glory and recognize that it is entirely on the basis of what he has done in and through us by his Spirit that matters. We cast our crowns before him because in the end, we're not going to look at ourselves as being special. We're going to look at him as being special. So the warning is, be careful how you look at yourself in relationship to others. We must not compare ourselves. Now, we must strive to grow and mature. I mean, there's no doubt of that. I mean, this is not an allegory saying, be stupid for the rest of your life. No, that's the wrong word. Not stupid. Ignorant for the rest of your life. Okay? No. Don't be ignorant. Learn. Grow. Understand. Dig deeper. Meditate. Memorize. Discuss. Learn. Right? We're to do that. That's obvious. But what we're not supposed to do is compare ourselves to others, thinking of ourselves better than others or less than others. Either one is wrong. So Bunyan puts this in as I think, as a little warning. Be careful how you relate yourself to others. You also kind of get the impression, don't you? I do. I don't know if you do, but I kind of get the impression as I read that particular paragraph that Faithful was in fact further along on the journey than Christian was. Just my perspective. Okay, so he gets up. Faithful helps him up. All right, come on, get up. All right, let me help you through this. Let's move on. Let's go down the road. And so now they begin to walk and have their discussion. And this gets interesting. Thus Christian began. So Christian says, okay, my honored and well-beloved brother Faithful, I am glad that I have overtaken you. that God has so tempered our spirits. I think in this case, overtaken doesn't mean I've run ahead of you. I think it's I've caught up to you. Okay? I'm glad that I have caught up to you, and God has so tempered our spirits that we can walk as companions in this so pleasant a path. All right? It's good to have fellowship with other believers. How long did you stay in the city of destruction before you set out after me on your pilgrimage? All right, that question is loaded, okay? Because it tells us a lot. It tells us that Faithful was also in the city of destruction, where Christian had come from, but left the city after Christian did. He had set out on his journey through the same path after Christian had done so. And Christian knows this. Apparently, according to that sentence, you would also get the impression, as you read a little further on as well, that Christian knew Faithful in the city prior to leaving. So Bunyan's setting us up here as another pilgrim who has come out of the world, the city of destruction, who has come out of the place that Christian has come out of, has found the gospel, probably in very much the same way that Christian has, and now has found himself in this place. And Christian asks, how long did you stay there? Now, I think the question is designed from Bunyan's perspective to draw our attention to what it is that Bunyan wants to say more about the city of destruction. You sort of get the impression here that Bunyan wants to talk more about the realities of the world that Christian had left behind, Faithful having been an observer in that place. Okay, so this is Bunyan's way of saying, let's talk more about the world that the Christian has left behind, that Faithful has also left behind. All right. So Faithful's answer is, till I could stay no longer. In other words, till I was forced out, till it was necessary for me to leave. For there was great talk presently, after you were gone out, that our city would, in short time, with fire from heaven, be burned down to the ground. Aha! Now that's interesting. Now, I want to pause here and talk about something which is called presuppositionalism. Brian's already caught the gist of where I'm going here, okay? Presuppositionalism. A presupposition is something that you believe as foundational or underneath other beliefs that you hold. It's a foundational truth that you hold that holds up another truth. It's something you presuppose. It's something that's supposed by you, but it's before, other facts and assumptions. So a presupposition is something that you hold to be true, which undergirds or is foundational or necessary to another belief that you hold. Okay? I'll give you what I think is the single greatest presupposition in the world. It's found in Romans chapter 1. Paul was a presuppositionalist. The greatest presupposition of humanity, Paul says, is there is a God and everybody knows it. Okay? Fundamentally, at the core of all things, Paul says, is that all men know there is a God. They know there's a creator. They know that this God created them. And a layer up from that, another supposition up from that, is not only do they know there is a God, but that he is to be worshipped. Or by definition, he is to be obeyed. They are to follow his law because he's the creator. Now, Paul does tell us, of course, in Romans 1 that those men out there with cold heart, reprobate hearts will do everything in their power to suppress that presupposition. What they will do is argue against the presupposition that they hold. They will actually live and argue against the very presupposition they hold at the very foundation. It's tantamount, when I became a presuppositionalist, I realized that it became rather futile, or it appears rather futile, to attempt to argue an atheist into a belief in God. Why? because he already believes there's one. He's suppressing it with all of his strength. How are you going to take an object out of the created world and show it to him and say, here is the evidence that there is a God? What's his reaction going to be? Well, I'm sorry, I'm suppressing that knowledge. So I'm not going to accept your evidence, no matter how well it's done. Now, I would also argue that one of the basic problems with that is also the fact that men's minds have been corrupted by sin such that they can't see the evidence even if they wanted to. So a presupposition or a presuppositional perspective is an underlying belief system that undergirds the rest of what you believe. You presume, you have certain presuppositions that undergird what you believe. And your goal, by the way, as an apologist, should be to dig out the presuppositions of who you're talking to. Dig them out. Help them to stop suppressing them by actually making them admit that they believe certain things to be true. You eventually can drill down into people to get out those fundamental presuppositions. Or they'll throw a stone at you and walk away. Okay, you win either way. All right, so the bottom line is, presuppositionalism is the belief system that there are certain presuppositions that precede other truths and realities. And that's what faithful is driving at here. There's another presupposition that fits by virtue of what I just said. There is a God and everybody knows it, and this God is to be obeyed. But the flip side of that presuppositional argument is, if you don't obey him, what comes? Judgment comes. Men know that there is a judgment coming against them because they inherently know, by definition, if there is a God who's established a law, and they know there's a God that's established a law, and you break the law, then the wrath of the ones who made the law should come against you. They know that to be true. They're also suppressing that with all their strength. They're also trying to say, this life is all there is. Trust me, this life is all there is. There is no judgment beyond this life. Just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. And they're trying to convince themselves that there is no judgment to be coming. Now, let's layer one layer up from that. If there is an assumption there's a God, and by definition from that there is judgment to come upon those who are wicked, break the law, then what becomes the thing that raises questions and doubts in the minds of those who are desperately trying to suppress that knowledge? And the answer is you, as followers of Christ. You, as a follower of Christ, are in fact a catalyst that raises up their own doubts about their presuppositions, or their suppressing of their presuppositions. Or let me say it more simply. Every time you walk into the room confessing Christ, they are immediately reminded of the fact there's a judgment to come. They're immediately reminded of that. They know it. I put it like this. Why do wicked men persecute Christians when Christians are the ones who build hospitals and orphanages and feed the poor and are kind and generous to others? Why do they persecute Christians? It's illogical, isn't it? It doesn't make sense. It's illogical. It's irrational. Why punish the people who are doing good for you, who are not trying to kill you, but rather to help you? And yet you try to kill them. Why? And the answer is because you, as a believer, represent what they are trying so desperately to suppress. They want you to go away so that they're not reminded of the fact there's judgment to come. The opposite of that, by the way, is what Paul says at the end of Romans 1, when he says that what men try to do is not only do they participate in all these wickednesses that are listed there, but they try to get others to do it as well. Why? Because the opposite of that is if I can get more wicked people to join me in my wickedness, then I will be able to suppress that more and more and more because I'll have some help. If I can get a few more people to agree with me that these things are good rather than evil, then I won't feel so bad. My conscience won't bother me so much, you see. You wonder why they're pushing this stuff so hard in our culture today? They're trying desperately to suppress their conscience in knowing that there is a judgment to come upon those who do such things. Christian was that catalyst in the city of destruction. When he left, what was the conversation? There's destruction coming. How did they know that? Because he left. And because they knew him leaving meant he was fleeing from the destruction that was to come. And now they're like, maybe there really is destruction coming. So the conversation, Faithful says, became all about the destruction of the city when Christian came. Because what happened is he was the very thing that raises up that reality in the hearts and minds of the wicked. See, I'm convinced Bunyan was a presuppositionalist. That's how he's thinking. He's thinking along the biblical lines of this is what happens. I mean, what did Jesus do exactly that drove the chief priests crazy to the point that they wanted to kill him? What did he do to them exactly? He did nothing. He made a claim at one point that if they killed him, he would rise again, and they tried to pin that on him as some sort of destruction of the temple thing. They killed him because they saw him as a threat. They saw him as a threat to their own livelihood. The chief priests and the Sadducees, who were in bed with the Romans, said, if we don't get rid of this guy, he might take away our political favor that we have with Rome. We need to get rid of this guy. He's done nothing wrong. Pilate knew it. Pilate looked at him and said, he's done nothing wrong. What are you talking about? But he was a threat just by his very existence. And the same is true with the Christian. We are a threat just by our very existence because those who see us are reminded when they look at us of the judgment that is coming. Christians leaving is the picture of that. Faithful says, so here I am in town, and guess what the conversation's all about? The conversation's all about the fact that you left and the destruction is coming. See it? So Faithful says, I stayed until I could stay no longer. Now, Christian then asks this question. He says, what? Did your neighbors talk so? And Faithful says, yes, it was for a while in everybody's mouth. Okay, it was for a while in everybody's mouth. Everybody wanted to talk about the fact that Christian had left and the destruction was coming. What? And did no more of them but you come out to escape the danger? In other words, was I the only one? Were you and me the only ones to have left the city, even though they knew there was destruction coming? Okay, this is where it gets interesting, because this is where the illogic and irrationality of men comes to play. They know in their souls that there's judgment to come, but will they do anything about it? No. Now, of course, as Reformed people, we would argue that they can't, right? That they're trapped in their wickedness, in their deceitful hearts, which lie to them, and the suppression of the knowledge of these things that they are put themselves in, that they cannot escape. But there's the illogic of it. There's judgment coming. It's sort of like the illogic of the law saving you, right? You know you can't be saved by it because you can't keep it perfectly, yet you say, I'll do it, or I'll try. This is who men are. The fall has made us, by virtue of the curse over our minds and hearts, incapable of looking at real facts and say, okay, this is what I ought to do. I ought to flee from the city of destruction. They can. But they do have a response, which Bunyan goes on with. So did no more of them but you come out to escape the danger? And Faithful replies, though there was, as I said, a great talk thereabouts, yet I do not think they did firmly believe it. In other words, what were they doing? Suppressing it. What were they doing? Okay, he talked about destruction, and yeah, we should be destroyed. But let's not talk about that. Okay? All right, see the logic of the sentence itself? We talked about it, there's destruction coming, and yet, let's not talk about that. For in the heat of the discourse, in the heat of the conversation amongst the people in the city of destruction, in the heat of the discourse, I heard some of the neighbors deridingly speak of you and of your desperate journey. For so they called this your pilgrimage, said Faithful. So what's the first thing they do? They belittle Christian. Don't listen to him. Nobody cares about him. He was talking about destruction coming, and we know there's destruction, but look, if he's gone, so let's stop thinking about him, and we'll just send him on his journey, and we'll just forget about it all. So they try to ignore us as followers of Christ. They try to ignore us. If we can just get rid of the Christians and push them into a corner somewhere. The real tactic most often used in our day is to actually change the Christians into more like them, which I would argue is back to the original presupposition. So he's gone off on some desperate journey. Yet your neighbor Pliable, remember him? Your neighbor Pliable, who came home bedabbled with the dirt of the slough of despond, slough or slough of despond, whichever way you want to pronounce it, they mock and despise as a turncoat. That's interesting. They turn against even one who himself turned against the faith and went back to the city of destruction. When he went into trouble, you remember when Pliable fell into the slough just as Christian had, and Pliable decides when they finally escape, I'm going back. It's too much work. It's too difficult. He's pliable, remember, because he's easily changed. So he runs back home, and he gets back home, Faithful says, and they called him a traitor because he had the audacity to leave, even though he came back. He's pliable, and we don't want to listen to him. So not only do they deride the true believer who leaves, but they even deride the false believers who turn back. Why? Because they cannot be faced with anything that will remind them that destruction is coming. We even have to turn against those who went out a little ways and came back. Don't even talk about them. In other words, we don't even want to talk about apostates if we can avoid it. See it? It's fascinating what the reprobate will do to avoid even considering the reality of judgment that's coming against them. But pray tell me, Christian then says, did you meet nobody in the valley of humiliation? Okay, so Bunyan turns away now from the city of destruction. What we have in the previous 2 or 3 paragraphs is Bunyan's attempt to go back and say, okay, let's talk for a bit about what the city of destruction looks like. And well, here's what we discover. We discovered that the world is going to despise the Christian and even the false Christian in order to try to avoid any discussion of the judgment that is to come. So Christian turns his attention away and turns now to the journey of faithful. All right, so tell me more about your journey as you left. Pray tell me, did you meet nobody in the valley of humiliation? Now, who do we assume that Christian or faithful should have met in the valley of humiliation? Apollyon. Doesn't mention Apollyon here. So faithful's journey is different than Christians, because all of us are going to have a different journey on the kinds of things we're going to face as we make this walk, okay? So he says, faithful says, yes, I met with one discontent who would willingly have persuaded me to go back with him. His reason was for that the valley was altogether without honor. It was altogether without any appreciable value as you walk it, is what that means. Discontent didn't find anything along the way that was valuable to him, and so he was discontent with it and he turned around. I think this would simply be another one of those falling into the various the various soils that Jesus speaks of in that great parable that grow up quickly and just kind of die off. They're discontent with the Christian faith in some sort of way. It's interesting that discontent makes it this far, gets to the valley of humiliation, and he's discontent in that, and he goes back home. He's not willing to press on, even as Christian himself had. In fact, you remember when we were talking about the reality of Apollyon, that, and also in the valley of the shadow of death, that Christian was in both cases having to ask the question, do I go back? Do I continue on? And of course, in each case, he decides to press forward. Well, discontented with it. This really isn't getting me anywhere. There's nothing particularly valuable in this. I'm not really gaining anything from it, and so I'm going to go back home, which he does. He told me, moreover, that there to go was the way to disobey all my friends, as, okay, now notice a few more people show up. My friends, pride, arrogancy, self-conceit, and worldly glory, and others. So he has, these are others that faithful has known in the past that probably are either friends that faithful has back at the city of destruction that he knew from the city of destruction, or who had set out on the journey. My guess is that they're just those that were back in the city. Men of pride, men of arrogance, self-conceit, worldly glory, all those things are synonyms of one another. Men who are more concerned about themselves and who they are than they are with anything else. They're filled with pride, they're filled with arrogancy, they're filled with self-conceit and worldly glory. They're only about themselves. So he said, moreover, that there was that there to go, discontent said this, to go was the way to disobey all my friends. So you're disobeying all your friends. Your friends told you to be more concerned about yourself than about anything else, and you should listen to them, discontent says to faithful. Who he knew, as he said, would be very much offended if I made such a fool of myself as to wade through this valley. So he was told by discontent. So discontent says, he would be very much offended if I, that is faithful, made such a fool of myself as to wade through this valley. Discontent says, why are you going this way? Why don't you come back with me? It's the temptation of discontentedness because we haven't achieved the goal yet. That's the point. As though we get certain ways along and say, I'm not really making any progress here. What's the point of all this? I'll go back, or I'll fall away. I would say that this is a case similar to the very beginning of the chapter, beginning of the section, that thinking about yourself in ways inappropriate, as though you're measuring yourself, as though there's a standard to measure by. Sometimes it's others, sometimes it's yourself. And you say, well, I'm not succeeding at this, I'm not making any progress at this, and therefore I'm going to turn around. This would be tantamount to us as believers saying, well, you know what, I still haven't conquered that particular sin, therefore I mustn't be a Christian, I'm going back. Or I'm just going to Forget about it. I'm not even going to try anymore. No sense. If we're not going to persevere in it, then we are very much the picture of discontent. Because that's what we're called to do, to persevere. Discontent, along with his friends, pride, arrogancy, self-conceit, and worldly gain, said, why are you bothering? Now again, that's how wicked men think. Their minds are such that it's all about them individually. So it makes sense that somebody who would come against Christian would say, hey, you know what? Your life would be a lot better off if you just stopped trying to pursue holiness. And you say, why? And he says back, because then you get to enjoy all the things of this world instead of all the things you give up for Christ. And our response back should be, well, I'm not really giving up anything because I'm not indulging in what you think is good. You've made it out to be good, but that doesn't mean it's good. Just because that you claim these things are good. Now, we're going to have an example of that in a second here, so hold on. It's making my point coming up again. Okay? So Christian then asks, so how did you answer him? How did you answer this one who wants to import his discontent into you? I told him that although all these that he named might claim kindred of me, and that rightly. In other words, these were friends of mine. Yes. I know what pride is. I know what arrogancy is. I know what self-conceit is. I I have these as friends. They're part of my flesh. I understand this to be the case. All right. So this is the way of Bunyan putting it to us that yes, you are going to find these realities, these sinful tendencies. The word you're looking for is these concupiscences in your flesh. They're there. And yes, they're going to come and say to you, why are you trying so hard? What did you answer him? I told him that although these might claim kindred of me, and that rightly, for indeed they were my relations according to the flesh, yet since I became a pilgrim, they have disowned me. I have also rejected them, and therefore they were to me now no more than if they had never been of my lineage. And Bunyan puts Mark 10:29 to 31 here. And you know this particular passage quite well, I imagine, once I read it to you. Chapter 10, starting in verse 26. Actually, let me go back to 24. And the disciples were amazed at his words, but Jesus said to them again, children, how difficult it is to enter the kingdom of God. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. So he sets some pretty high standards as to what it means to enter the kingdom of heaven. Christian would go, yeah. And they were exceedingly astonished and said to him, then who can be saved? Jesus looked at them and said, with man it is impossible, but not with God. For all things are possible with God. So again, the standard from a human perspective is impossible, but it's not impossible with God. So Peter then says, Peter the impetuous one, I'm absolutely convinced that you're right when you say that Mark got this from Peter, because this is Peter making a tremendous confession. Peter says, see, we've left everything and followed you. Aren't we special? Jesus said, truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and children, brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands, with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. That's the quote that Bunyan puts here. He says, what he's saying is faithful left all these things behind in order to follow Christ. And that's what it takes. You're going to have to leave all of these things behind. Now, Jesus consoles his disciples by saying, you got to leave everything behind, but what you are going to gain is far greater than what you left behind. Now, the mistake that some make is reading that and saying, well, see, Jesus promises us we're going to have houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands and all these kinds of things as we become Christians, as though there's some sort of material blessings in here, and Jesus fixes that by saying, with persecutions. It's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about material blessings. He's talking about the spiritual blessings of knowing this Christ, walking this path, and knowing that Christ is everything. And I don't need anything but him. And so Faithful is saying to Christian, yes, all of these things that I looked at in my own life, that I was proud about, all the things I was arrogant about, all the things I was self-conceited about, all the things that I had as worldly glory, they looked to me like wonderful things that I wanted to hang on to. I left them all behind, and rightly so. Discontent wanted me to go back to all those things. But I said no, because I've rejected them. Oh, it's interesting, they've rejected him too. He says they've rejected him. Therefore, they were to me now no more than if I had never been of my lineage. There is no going back to these things. So, Faithful describes the reality of us having to consider that when we come out of that destruction under the wrath of God that's going to come, when we come out from under that, and we of course know it entirely by the grace of God, when we come out of that, we need to be willing to say that old life, that old reality, those old things are done, gone, over, finished. There is no going back. This journey is tough. Discontent's like, it's too tough, I'm going to go home. And I'm going to go back to all the things that I thought were great, which are all lies, but, and Faithful says, no, I can't do that. I put them behind. They're not a part of me anymore. You could almost insert Romans 16:14 here. Sin will have no dominion over you. And then Faithful continues. He says, I escaped the slough or slough of despond too, only I met with one whose name was wanton. Wanton. Now, the word wanton has two different definitions. The modern definition of the word wanton is the idea of, I closed the tab. All right, let me get it back up here. Okay, the first definition is, when you think of wanton, you think of things like deliberate or unprovoked, particularly of an action, or particularly a cruel or violent action of some sort. So a wanton sense of doing something in the most deliberate and unprovoked sort of way. You kind of think of a wanton person as just running headlong into something. Okay, that's the first definition that you get. But there's an older definition that's probably the one that Bunyan is using here, okay? Because you got to rewind yourself back here to the 17th century. How would he look at this word, okay? And there's an older definition of this that some dictionaries don't even include anymore. In fact, the one I was looking at called it a dated definition because it's not really used that way anymore. It really ought to be, but it's not. And it's someone who is unrestrained sexually. Someone who thinks of sex as a casual thing. Now, interesting, it's in a feminine form. It's typically used of a woman. And Bunyan paints it as a woman in this picture here. That's why I believe he's using this in that dated sense, in that sense that we don't really use it so much anymore. It would really be offensive if you walked up to somebody and called them a wanton person in that old definition. Today they would probably go, whatever. But that's how Bunyan is putting it, okay? This is a woman who comes to her, and he says, with a flattering tongue she had. She comes to her, to him, sorry, get my pronouns all mixed up here. She comes to him. In the picture that you would think in your mind here is of a prostitute. That's the picture he's painting. He doesn't use the word here. He uses the word wanton instead. But he's got this idea of her having a flattering tongue. She lay at me hard to turn aside with her, to turn away in terms of a wanton sense. Now, I would say that Bunyan is importing here very quickly, he's importing here a physical gratification aspect to those who would try to convince you to leave the faith and go back. She comes with this flattering tongue. I could make a very good case, couldn't I, that just about everything that the wicked eventually wind up doing winds up in sex in some way. That the wickedness goes to sex. That's Paul's argument in Romans 1, isn't it? God turns them over, they become sexually deviant, they become more sexually deviant, they become even more sexually deviant. It all comes back to sex. And the reason why is because sex, gender, our sexuality is at the very essence of what we are, because God said at the beginning, let us create man in our image, male and female. It eventually gets there. All right, so Bunyan, I think, is willing to paint that reality. Faithful is even being pressed hard against by sexual temptation to go back and leave his journey. And at the foot of the hill, I met an aged man called Adam the First. Adam the First? Who would that guy be? Adam the First, the man at the beginning, who dwelt in the town of Deceit. Christian hasn't encountered the city of Deceit, but apparently Faithful did along the way on his journey, at least as the allegory proceeds. Bunyan inserts it here. The idea being that he meets the first man who lives in the house or the town of Deceit. I think it's probably best to say that Adam is best characterized by the lie. Why? Because he believed it and ate from the tree. He was deceived. He lives in the town of Deceit. And so Faithful runs into him. But the question is why? Why does Bunyan paint this in? All right. His work, he said, was many delights and wages, that I should be his heir at last. All right. Romans 5, 6-21, probably my favorite passage of Scripture in general, is a discussion of the juxtaposition between the first man, the first Adam, Adam the first, and the second Adam, Adam the second, who is, of course, Christ Jesus. And Paul's argument in Romans chapter 5, as he crosses from justification to sanctification, is to make one final point, that the reality is that human beings have all been imputed with the guilt and the pollution of Adam the first. And then points out that those who belong to Christ have been imputed with the righteousness that he has earned, and the guiltlessness now that they possess in him. So he discovers Adam the first, that I should be his heir. In other words, a convincing of him, if you will, that he is to go, Faithful is to go back, leave this because, well, you belong to Adam's race. You belong to Adam's race. Marry my daughters. Okay, this is Adam the first speaking to Faithful. Marry my daughters. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life, he said. These are what Adam the first offers us in our natural fallen state. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, pride of life. the reality of living under the guilt and pollution of original sin imputed to us by being born human in the lineage of Adam. Come back to the world and all of its pleasures and all of its promises, you see. It's juxtaposition, exactly what Jesus said. You got to give up what? Everything to follow after him. You got to give up home, lands, family. You got to give it all up. And you got to take on the persecutions that go with it as belonging to that group. Isn't that ironical? You have to take up all of that in order to leave behind. But the old Adam, the old flesh, the old nature is always knocking. It's always knocking. As I turned to go, I'm sorry I missed this, but looking at his forehead, I saw there written, put off the old man and his deeds. Colossians chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. Oh, that's familiar. Put off the old self, remember? Put off the old self with all of its carnal inclinations and put on the new self. Put off what Adam was to put on what Christ is. See? So Faithful ends his discourse by saying, as I turned to go, I felt him take hold of my flesh and give me a deadly twitch in the back. And I think this is Bunyan's way of saying, you know what? That flesh is always close. It's always going to give you a little twitch in the back because it's always going to be nagging at you to want to follow its lusts and its passions, the things of this world, the things of the flesh, all of the various aspects of the old Adam, all of the realities of living in the city of destruction amongst the wicked, with them all around you, persecuting you for these things, trying to drive you away from Christ so that it soothes their conscience. All of these things are part of this experience. Faithful gives to Christian here a commentary on his particular version of this journey. It has been a struggle for me, Faithful says, against the temptations and desires of the flesh and this world and all of its conceits and prides and so forth, even in the midst of those who would hate me for even considering leaving them. Sound familiar to any of you? Well, let me rephrase that. Feel familiar to any of you? I read this chapter, when I was reading this chapter, go, oh man, that is so me. That is so me. And it ain't just green M&Ms I'm talking about. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the world, the lust of vainglorious things are a constant pull against us. If you don't believe me, just try scrolling through Amazon Prime Day ads. Ooh, I want that. It's always there. That's Faithful's point. It's always there. But what's his underlying reaction? I'm going to go forward anyways. I have to go forward anyways. So once again, Bunyan gives to us a sense of what the Christian life looks like, the kinds of things we have to face and the realities that we must press on, listening to the words of our Lord that we must carry on, leave the world behind.